Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 366. And this time I'm going to talk about this record, which originally came out on Prestige in 1957, Tenor Conclave. Here, my version, which is a 1962 reissue, is credited to John Coltrane as the leader, with Hank Mobley, Zoot Sims, and Cohn as the supporting cast. The original is, in theory, credited to the Prestige All-Stars, with Mobley getting first billing, but basically a collection of equals. The labels on the original credit the four tenor saxes. Anyway, as I say, this one is from 1962. Coltrane is noted as a leader because by that point his stature was by far the greatest. This version differs in two other ways from the original, in that it has a different running order for the tracks, and it also replaces Ira Gitler's original liner notes with a slightly inferior set. This is a fascinating record because it allows the listener a fairly rare opportunity to compare and contrast four tenors from the golden age of small group jazz. In throwing these four players together for a one-off session, this album might have some potential weaknesses, but those could also potentially be seen as strengths. The different styles, which each of the players brings to the session, and the impromptu nature of the session means you don't really know what you're going to get. Anyway, whether or not four saxophones is inherently a good idea, it's not often that you get to hear four tenors playing in one small bop combo, so you can add uniqueness to the appeal of this record. As those of you who are familiar with Prestige records will know, in the late 1950s, Bob Weinstock essentially had Rudy Van Gelder's Hackensack studio reserved every Friday afternoon. He'd show up from Manhattan with a fairly random collection of musicians, and magic would ensue. This is one of those so-called blowing sessions, and it features four tenors who at that particular point were in somewhat different places. Coltrane, of course, is in retrospect the biggest single name involved here, but at the time he was arguably the least well-established musician. At this point, he was around a year into his first tour with Miles Davis's First Great Quintet, and two of his Miles Davis bandmates are here as well, Red Garland on piano and Paul Chambers on bass. But this version of Coltrane was not the Coltrane he'd become. Miles might have gotten clean a year or two before, but Coltrane was still using heroin, and that was becoming a bit of an issue. He was still very much a sideman at this point, searching for his own sound. Hank Mobley, arguably historically in Coltrane's shadow, is at this point the bigger deal of the two. He'd made some great records with Art Blakey, Jazz Messengers with Horace Silver, and at this point he'd become a go-to guy in the studio for Blue Note Records, both as a leader and as a sideman. Anyway, both those guys are acknowledged these days as giants of the East Coast tenor school, but I'd like to focus in this video on their two co-leaders, Zoot Sims and Cohn, who these days are perhaps less well known despite being well-established members of the 50s jazz fraternity. I haven't talked much about either Zoot Sims or Cohn on the channel to date. I will be doing so later this year because both of them deserve a spotlight on themselves specifically, but it's also hard to talk about them independently because for 40 years they shared a musical project one way or the other as collaborators all the way from the late 1940s until Zoot's death in 1985. Zoot Sims was born John Haley Sims in 1925 in Inglewood, which at that point was just a rural suburb of LA. He was born into a vaudeville family. There were instruments lying around. He played around with some of them, the clarinet for a while, and then focuses on the tenor sax after being inspired by Lester Young. In his teens, he starts playing with some minor big bands in and around LA, does a little bit of touring, mostly hones his craft on the Central Avenue scene in LA, which was basically the 52nd Street of the West Coast. And in 1943, he's discovered by Benny Goodman. At age 18, he goes east with Goodman, and despite Goodman being a big name, his real big break comes in 1947 when he joins Woody Herman's orchestra. This was Woody Herman's so-called second herd, and it had a signature sound of a bank of saxophones, three tenors and a baritone. The other tenors were Herbie Stewart, somewhat forgotten these days, Stan Getz, definitely not forgotten, and the baritone was played by Serge Chaloff from Boston. These four saxophonists became known as the Four Brothers, which was also the title of their signature tune, written by Jimmy Giuffre. Stewart leaves at the end of 1947, and the very next month, Cohn comes in to replace him on tenor. Cohn was born in Brooklyn. He's just 3 weeks younger, I think, than Sims. He, too, was self-taught. He, too, was inspired to take up the tenor sax by Lester Young, and he, too, starts cutting his teeth in his late teens playing with some local big bands. He bounces from band to band as his reputation grows, and just prior to joining Woody Herman in 1948, he'd been with Buddy Rich. I think Cohn is an underappreciated soloist, and in addition to slotting in very well with Herman's band, he clicked right away with Sims. This version of the second herd becomes very successful enough for Herman to relocate them out to Hollywood. 1948 proves a very successful year for all involved, but by 1949, both Zoot and Cohn decide it's time to look for greener pastures, independently, I should say. Cohn goes back to New York right away. Eventually, Sims follows him there as well. They both play a little bit with Artie Shaw's orchestra, and they also both feature on recordings on Prestige and Savoy Records. In the early 50s in New York, as well as performing and recording, Cohn starts to get lots of writing and arranging work. Sims, for his part, joins Stan Kenton's band, but famously falls out with Kenton after a bus crash at the side of the freeway. They got into an argument. Apparently there was some spitting involved. No apologies were forthcoming, and Sims is out of the band. Zoot goes back to LA, but he falls on hard times. For a couple of years, he can get really nothing going there. He's eventually rescued by Jerry Mulligan, who is winding up his own West Coast adventure, putting together a sextet in which he includes Zoot, and they head to New York. Back in New York, things really begin to look up for Zoot. He's making dozens of records for all kinds of labels, both as a leader and as a sideman in 1955 and 1956. He also reconnected with Al Cohn, and there are various attempts that they make to form a band. They did make a recording date in January 1956, which was released in 1957 as a release by the Al Cohn Zoot Sims Sextet from A to Z. Things wouldn't really click for the Sims-Cohn partnership as co-leaders until 1957, when they made Al and Zoot for Choral Records. But in the meantime, somewhere in this period of flux, they took a call from Bob Weinstock to come out with him to Hackensack on a Friday afternoon and join in the blowing session, which results in this record. This record is made September 7th, 1956 at Rudy Van Gilder's studio in Hackensack, New Jersey, with Bob Weinstock as the producer. Because it's one of those Friday afternoon blowing sessions, there are of course some standards involved, but there are also a couple of compositions by Hank Mobley, who by this point was really blossoming as a writer. The tenor men are as previously advertised. 2/3 of Miles's then rhythm section is present, Red Garland on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, the one absentee being Philly Joe Jones. Art Taylor's on drums, and his presence and Philly Joe's absence is kind of interesting because, of course, Taylor would regularly fill in for Philly Joe, who was a regular user and who sometimes couldn't get it together in time for a gig with Miles. And in fact, Taylor's on record as saying that he owes his career, or at least the early part of it, to Philly Joe not showing up. So I'm just speculating here, but it may actually have been Philly Joe who originally got the call. I mentioned that on this 1962 reissue, the running order is a bit different. On the original, Bob's Boys kicks off the record and the title track starts side 2. On this reissue and many subsequent reissues, Tenor Conclave kicks off side 1. As you might imagine, on a record with 4 tenor sax players, it is a bit of a challenge to figure out who's who. Now, not entirely, because Mobley is pretty easy to pick out. Coltrane, even at this stage of his development, is very easy to pick out. But Sims and Cohn, notoriously or famously, have a very similar tone. So when I talk about the solos here, I'm relying to some extent on my crowdsourcing of internet wisdom. Tenor Conclave starts off with Mobley, who wrote the tune, then you have Sims and Cohn, and then Coltrane's unmistakable sound. Even though his playing had several evolutions to undergo before his star began to rise, there are no sheets of sound here, his assertive or almost impatient style is there for all to hear. He practically sweeps Cohn's last notes aside. All the rhythm players take a solo, and then there's a concluding section when all 4 saxes take 4 bars each back and forth for about a minute, and it is a total gas to try and figure out exactly who's who. Just You, Just Me is an old Broadway number by Jesse Greer. It's easy to say in retrospect, but Coltrane, again, really stands out here. It's not that he plays better, because the other 3 are all masters in their own way, but he's so distinctive that his subsequent stardom is not surprising. On side 2, Bob's Boys is a great example of the different styles that all the musicians are bringing. Coltrane roars out of the blocks. Cohn counters with a very lyrical piece of playing. Mobley occupies the middle ground, as he did so effectively for much of his career. Then Sims is back in the ring to take another swing for team lyricism. Finally, however, we come to How Deep Is the Ocean, which, in my view, is the gem of this record and also one of the great tracks of Prestige's 1950s output. Cohn's leadoff solo is gorgeous. It's set apart from the other tenors by Garland's wistful playing, and then Chambers has a very nice arco solo. But the star turn of this whole track is Mobley's, whose breathy tone matches the mood of the song perfectly. It's safe to say this is not an LP that leaves you feeling you were underserved in the tenor department. There are multiple styles here, from the Woody Herman-esque head arrangements to Mobley's confident hard boppery and Coltrane's muscular sound, kind of an embryo, but it all works, at least to a point. I'd say the principal drawback of this record is, as you might suspect, that the tenors are so omnipresent that they leave you craving relief. So it's not a perfect record, but you do need this version of How Deep Is the Ocean in your collection. For me, it's 3.5 out of 5 stars.